What's going on? Welcome into a wild card edition of Empty the Notebook. I'm Evan Washburn, as always, alongside Aditi Kinkhabwala. This is the show that will often take you into the production meetings on the sidelines, a little behind the scenes on our life as reporters covering this league. But this weekend was a little bit different for a variety of reasons. And right now, Aditi, the news is coaching news. It's two storylines and two seasons really going on at the same time. We have the playoffs, but we also have the hiring cycle. And an update in that realm, Mike McCarthy is no longer the head coach of the Dallas Cowboys. I guess technically not let go or fired. His contract ran out this after 5 seasons in Dallas. A pretty good win percentage at about 58%, just one playoff win. But it appears that Mike McCarthy will now try and take his services somewhere else. So your instant reaction to news that I wouldn't say is shocking, but is still of importance as we enter, again, this coaching cycle.
Evan, you say wild card, and the first thing I was thinking is what a wild morning. And you're right. We sort of saw this. Mike McCarthy's contract expires at midnight tomorrow, midnight Tuesday. And we do know that the Bears requested permission to interview him last week, and the Cowboys had said no. But at the same time, there didn't seem to be a lot of activity going on with the negotiations. And there were multiple reports out there that there, in fact, had not been any negotiations. Of course, the news just broke from multiple insiders around the NFL world that the two sides have decided to go their separate ways. Tom Pelissero, an old colleague of mine at the NFL Network, has said that the two sides couldn't agree on a length of a deal. That's something actually that I was told might be a sticking point between the two. But now we know that the Bears are interested in Mike McCarthy. We know that the Saints are interested in Mike McCarthy. But these are also two teams that have been interested in some other people, like Aaron Glenn, some other potential first-time head coaches. So, Evan, you tell me, you think Mike McCarthy is for sure going to get another job? Or do you think that there are a lot of hot young coaching candidates out there who are more likely to slide in?
It's a great question. I don't know about for sure. It's a great pool too to choose from. When you mentioned you have the
Right.
youth of a Ben Johnson and the up and comer and Aaron Glenn, who has an established brand as both a player and now as a coach, and has not only a defensive acumen but the ability to lead. And Mike Vrabel, as we know, being introduced to the New England Patriots right now as their new head coach. I do think Mike McCarthy, if I had to sort of take a side, will be a head coach next year. I think the two most obvious landing points would be New Orleans or Chicago. Chicago, one, could be quite polarizing because while he has a long history of being able to work and succeed with talented quarterbacks and has an offensive bend, there is the sense that Chicago wants something new and fresh. And I'm not necessarily Mike McCarthy brings that. And what are you appeasing there? Is that a fan base? Is that just some buzzwords? And then the New Orleans just job in general, Aditi, we haven't talked about this, is interesting to me because I think the stakes are so low there. People don't talk or think about New Orleans unless they're good. So the idea you could go there and maybe work and build and grow with some patience, mostly because people aren't interested in what's happening, could also sound somewhat desirable. But I do think Mike McCarthy will find himself somewhere in 2025. But we can't spend too much time on this because we got to talk games and we got to talk our wild card weekend experience as we empty the notebook here. Look, I was in Houston for the first game of what feels like basically 10 years ago now of the weekend. And you were consuming all this from, I would say, probably, and I'll let you lay it out, maybe a fan slash professional perspective, but just the 30,000 foot view. One of the things you're thinking about right now, your takeaway of Wild Card Weekend, and we still have one game to play tonight, Rams Vikings.
I will say this very quickly on a personal level. I don't know how much fun it is to watch football in my house when my husband is home, because during the Steelers-Ravens game, I found myself yelled at repeatedly. And I kept trying to say, hey, I'm just offering some professional advice and to whatever was happening on the field. And I was told to pipe down repeatedly. So let's start with last night, Evan, because that game, that Commanders-Bucks game, and what we saw Jaden Daniels do yet again, so cool at the end of the game. And this ties in with what you're saying about Mike McCarthy and Chicago and Caleb Williams. Do they want a young coach that they could see potentially ride out the next 10 years with Caleb Williams, someone that he can grow with? Or do they like the idea of someone who is seasoned and experienced? So going back to the job that Dan Quinn has done in Washington, completely changing the culture, taking on a media group that is not necessarily the easiest, and also guiding, as a CEO, guiding this young quarterback. How many comeback wins is it now for him? 7? Is that what he's led?
This is his 5th fourth quarter comeback, ties Patrick Mahomes for the league lead.
Thank you for correcting me. That's what it's unbelievable what we are seeing out of him. That's why he was atop my Rookie of the Year ballot for sure. And you use this phrase, so I'm plagiarizing you, but you said that essentially they're playing with house money, that it's all gravy now. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, Evan, that's when a team is most dangerous, right? When there are no expectations.
No doubt. I think everything that's happened this year is a dream scenario for a Washington organization that is seemingly changing on the fly. And I agree. I mean, of Wild Card Weekend, that game, the moments, the swings, the fourth quarter decisions of Dan Quinn. I mean, he basically was doing a Dan Campbell impression, and that these two now meet Saturday night in the divisional round, going 3 for 5 on fourth down. It was such a fun game to consume. My big picture takeaway, and we'll get into the Texans game in our second segment, and we'll empty the notebook on some other stuff, but it was a reminder that it is the opening round of the playoffs, because the reality is most of the games were, I would say, decided in the second half. And it felt like maybe teams and matchups that if they were happening in week 7 or week 11, we wouldn't be spending much time on today. But it doesn't take away from the excitement and the buildup. But it does make for some challenging sort of, what does this mean for the team that loses? I thought that the Eagles kind of sleptwalked through their game, and that's a testament to their talent. And I thought Baltimore showed that they are really to be reckoned with. And we felt that way really the last couple of years. But the Derrick Henry element to this, you can't say enough about what he's doing right now alongside Lamar Jackson to run for nearly 300 yards as an offense against the Pittsburgh Steelers. I know they're kind of a mess right now, especially defensively. That says a lot about the type of team that's heading to Buffalo to take on a Bills team that also kind of showed what they can do in this new direction, as you've laid out really well with Joe Brady, and they're running the ball. So that becomes the titanic matchup, as we know, on CBS Sunday afternoon. But I think my big picture takeaway, even experiencing the weekend, Aditi, was just that it's still just the opening round of the playoffs. The real matchups of heavyweights and equal contenders starts to happen this weekend.
That's very fair. And I hope in our next block we get into a little bit of the what comes next, because as you know, I live in Steelers country, and there's a lot of noise around here right now. I'll say that, Evan.
All right, well, we'll rush to break now so we can get back and talk some more about these games. Stay with us. Back into Empty the Notebook, Evan alongside Aditi, and this is what we call an addition, a late add to the rundown, because I thought you had a great tease there before we went to break about some of the teams that lost this weekend and the way maybe the organization / fan base is feeling. So you've got the Chargers, the Steelers, the Broncos, and the Bucks. And I think it's pretty clear, and this is where your perspective, both as someone who's been in and around it, but also just the way you're able to cover the league, Aditi, will offer what I think for Pittsburgh has to be the one coming out of this weekend feeling the worst about where they are moving forward. And there's more questions than really answers at this point.
There's no question about that. You're right. Look, the Chargers engineered a complete and total culture change under Jim Harbaugh. Yes, that was disappointing, but at the same time, you know that they're growing and that their arrow is pointed up. The Broncos, look at what they were able to do with rookie Bo Nix. That team is really in Sean Payton's image now. That was a great first step. The Bucks, that was disappointing. Baker Mayfield said those mistakes are going to sit with him. We don't know how many more years they have with Mike Evans. But again, those are good steps. If they can hold on to Liam Cohen and he doesn't take a head coaching job, you know that team's going to build. The Steelers. But first, Evan, you have to tell me, am I allowed to talk about the Steelers? Because as I said, my husband has not taken it well when I've discussed the Steelers the last 2 days.
Well, didn't you say he's headed to Europe soon? He's about to be out of the country. You're in good. You've got freedom. Just make sure he doesn't watch this on the plane.
He's not gone yet, but yes. You know what? Here's the thing. The Steelers, I think, are enormously, grossly disappointing for numerous reasons. They started 10-3 and then lost five in a row. That defense, the highest paid defense in the NFL, that defense that is completely designed and called by Mike Tomlin, was gashed, as you made the point, by Derrick Henry and friends twice in the last month. I mean, Saturday night was horrific if you were a fan of Steelers defense. And then the calls for Mike Tomlin's head. This is the thing here, Evan. Every great team that I've ever been around, and you've heard Mike Vrabel say this a lot, every great team that I've ever been around has really, really strong player leadership. There's a strong sense of accountability and culture that comes from players. There's only so much that a head coach can do. And the thing with the Steelers is that as they keep having these non-losing records, and they keep going to the playoffs and losing because, P.S., they haven't won a playoff game in 8 years, there's no real incentive to roll the roster. And it's time to get new blood, but that's not necessarily at the head coaching position. That's within that locker room. Now, there are great players there, but a great player doesn't necessarily mean a great leader. It doesn't necessarily mean somebody who holds other players and his teammates accountable. And that offense has been lacking sincere, authentic leadership for a long, long time now. So even though everyone in this city is, not everyone, but even though there is a very loud drumbeat for Mike Tomlin's head, the Steelers are not going to trade Mike Tomlin. The Steelers are not going to move on from Mike Tomlin. But there does need to be a strong imperative to think about how that locker room fits together and what is the chemistry within that room.
Well said. It's going to be a fascinating offseason within that organization. And as we know, they are not reactionary. And I'm sure that frustrates many that would be satisfied by sweeping change. But you just have to believe that's not going to happen. Empty the Notebook is built on just sort of taking our viewers and listeners to where we are every weekend. I was fortunate to be in Houston for that wild card matchup with the Chargers. There was so much built into this, Aditi, and I do want to mention it because it's still an ongoing devastation and tragedy of what's going on in LA and the wildfires. And that was really in the backdrop of our game because we had the LA Chargers and the organization was impacted by it. And not to say that had anything to do with the football game or the outcome, and it really put everything into perspective. I did walk away from that game thinking not so much about where the Chargers go from here, but the Texans' ability to reset after an embarrassing loss on Christmas Day and where they are now. And I think that was what we got from our time in those rooms, specifically with CJ Stroud and him being vulnerable to the idea that so much has been put on his shoulders this year and this team's shoulders based off of what was a darling of a season a year ago. They basically had the same season. Statistically, things were a bit off. The record was the exact same. But he made the point that having all the primetime games, having the wacky 3 games in 11-day schedule that included that embarrassing loss to the Ravens, they couldn't fix things, and they needed to. They'd lost Stephon Diggs. They lost Tank Dell. Their offensive line was a mess, but they got back to work after that game. They didn't go into a shell. They went to practice. They put on pads. They went really at fixing the problems. And I don't know if they're going to beat the Chiefs. That's going to be a tall order. But I was extremely impressed Saturday afternoon in the way that CJ Stroud responded and that defense responded, because much like the Pittsburgh Steelers on Saturday night, Baltimore did that to that Texans defense. They embarrassed them. Well, the Texans defense faced a Chargers offense that is basically built in the same fashion as Baltimore, with, as we know, Greg Roman coming from Baltimore, Joe Ortiz bringing a lot of the personnel and the identity of how they build rosters to LA. And they punched them in the mouth. And I think that was my takeaway from that game, was that was the first time LA wasn't the bully in a game. The Texans defense was, and then CJ Stroud, Joe Mixon, Nico Collins, all these guys, they made plays as well. But really impressed, and it starts with the leadership of DeMeco Ryans in, again, not letting this team fall apart when everybody on the outside had them dead to rights really after Christmas.
It's so true. You're right about DeMeco Ryans in every way and the way he knows how to push the right buttons. But The very first thing you said was CJ Stroud. And for me, this sophomore season, in fact, we talked about this last week in Is a Sophomore Slump a Real Thing?
Mhm.
This season has been a heck of a lot harder for him than it was a year ago. And so much of that is because teams have gotten that year of tape on him. They have better ideas of what to do. And he is do against him. He has remained unbowed. And that is almost a bigger sign than anything about the Texans' future. And I wouldn't count them out. Evan, we keep talking about this, that we doubt the Chiefs at our own peril, but the Texans sure showed us something, and they're clearly not afraid of anyone.
And he had a great line, Aditi, and this is, again, sort of the lifeblood of what we do when you have these meetings and you're feverishly taking notes on what they're saying, thinking, all right, how would I communicate this, weave this into a broadcast? And I don't think we actually got this in Saturday afternoon. And obviously CJ's a man of faith. He makes that clear, and it's obviously a big part of his life. And this doesn't so much fall into that area, but it was a great line. He said, the mountaintops are great. And he enjoyed the mountaintops a year ago and for portions of the beginning of this season. But he said, you learn more and you grow more from the valleys. And I think having that perspective as a guy who was 22 when this season started, is now just a fresh 23. That's not something I ever had at that age, and I don't think many do. And to be able to say that, and obviously he's thinking about it and actively making that part of his day-to-day approach to this job that has so much pressure attached to it. Again, really impressed with what he brought to that game and the way it started too. It didn't start well at all. I mean, we all thought, talking in breaks early in that game, man, LA's got their stamp on this one. This is going to be tough for Houston. And ironically, or coincidentally, I never get that correct, a fumbled snap that leads to a broken play and a 36-yard completion to Xavier Hutchinson kind of woke him up, and the old CJ was back.
And you mentioned Joe Mixon earlier. I know you'll want to give us a little bit more on that, but I think his experience in playoff games with the Bengals certainly has to help in that huddle and help on that field.
No, great point. I'm glad you brought that up, because Joe Mixon, not only did he do his thing in the second half of that game, he told us in the meeting that he sees a real comp to the 2021 Cincinnati Bengals that he was a part of that made it to the Super Bowl in this Houston team. I mean, he was getting down to the nuts and bolts of second-year quarterback Joe Burrow to second-year quarterback CJ Stroud, injuries throughout the season, and some adversity, getting hot at the right time. And he just believes in trying to speak things and manifest things and speak it into existence. So whether you live or agree with that comparison, I found it interesting, but you're 100% right. That locker room needs Joe Mixon because of what he's been through when it comes to playoff football.
I'm with you on that. And again, it's just as we were talking about with the Steelers, sometimes, and especially this time of year, it's that locker room leadership, it's that player leadership that can make all the difference.
All right, when we come back, as we do every show, we're going to throw some flags on some statements made across Wild Card Weekend. Welcome back into Empty the Notebook. Time to throw some flags. If you've seen the show, you know how this works. We'll each present a statement to one another, and if we agree with it, the flag stays in our pocket. But if we disagree with it, then you throw the flag and you announce why it's a penalty. So, Aditi, I think you got one for me to kick us off.
All right, let's go. Evan, it is totally okay, maybe not for you and me, but for a player, it is totally okay to read a book on the sideline.
I think it'd be more of a problem if you and I were reading a book on the sideline while trying to cover the game. Obviously, this is in reference to A.J. Brown reading, I want to make sure I get this correct, Inner Excellence by Jim Murphy, which is a book that helps train the mind for extraordinary performance and the best possible life. I'm here for it. I'm not throwing the flag on this. I think it's okay as long as it's not being distracting to others. Whatever you need to do as a player to get yourself in the proper headspace to go out there and compete and make plays. And look, we know A.J. Brown is not he's not shy of expressing his belief in what the offense needs to do or how he can better be utilized in the offense. And I think in the realm of wide receiver behavior, this is pretty positive.
Totally agree with you. Way better than throwing a tablet, which I've seen a wide receiver do. Way better than yelling at quarterback, which I've also seen a wide receiver do. And it's just like you said, whatever is going to send you, whatever is going to better prepare you, I'm here for it. No flags.
Awesome. All right, here we go. This one's a tough one. I don't even know if I want any part of it. The Bills-Ravens winner will make the Super Bowl. So that means the Bills-Ravens winner will beat either the Chiefs or, hey, the Texans in an AFC championship game.
I told you, every time I pick against the Chiefs, I am made to look like a fool. But you know what? I'm going to say yes.
Oh!
You know what? You can.
I'm throwing the flag. I'm throwing the flag. I don't want to put myself in Chiefs doubters kingdom.
I'm not. This year, I was wrong twice last year. I was wrong when I picked the Bills over the Chiefs. I was wrong when I picked the Ravens over the Chiefs. But it is a new year. Yes, I like the Bills and the Ravens more. And I think one of them will end up in the Super Bowl in New Orleans.
Yeah, make sure the Texans get this too. They want to be part of this conversation after we just praise them for 10 minutes. All right, let's close it out here. Give me first crack at this one, and maybe you can throw in your thought as well.
All right. For you, are you throwing the flag on the idea that the Rams will upset the Vikings tonight?
I am going to throw the flag. I think this is a game that has a lot surrounding it. As we know, real life stuff happening out there in LA, and we're thinking about everybody. This game moved to Arizona. I like the Vikings bouncing back after their loss to Detroit. I think they come into this one and they take care of business against LA. Do you have any thoughts on this one before we say goodbye?
You know, obviously our prayers with Sean McVay, whose family had to evacuate, but I do, and anybody else in the organization who has been affected, I will say this, I like the Vikings too, and I love that defense.
Awesome. Fun show, Aditi. If you missed any of it, make sure to head to the NFL on CBS YouTube channel. We're off next week, and we'll see you championship week for a recap. Thanks for watching.